When David's grandfather passed away, he left behind more than just memories. The old man had owned a beautiful piece of land out in the suburbs, 15 acres of rolling hills and oak trees that had been in the family for generations. David had spent summers there as a kid, running through the fields and helping his grandpa fix the old barn. Now it was his. The property came with a simple farmhouse that needed some work, but David didn't mind. He was tired of his cramped apartment in the city anyway. Within a month of the funeral, he'd packed up his life and moved out to the family land. It felt right, like coming home. His grandfather had been the organized type, the kind of man who labeled everything and kept files going back decades. David found boxes full of old documents in the study. Property deeds, survey maps, tax records, all neatly arranged in folders with dates written on the tabs. The old man had even left a letter explaining where everything was. It was typical of him, always thinking ahead. The property was bigger than David remembered. The long driveway that connected to the main road was actually more like a private street. It stretched for almost half a mile, winding through the trees before reaching the farmhouse. His grandfather had paved it himself years ago, back when he still had the energy for projects like that. Everything seemed perfect for the first few weeks. David spent his days painting rooms, fixing loose boards, and getting to know his new neighbors. Well, neighbor. There was only one other property nearby, a new housing development called Riverside Meadows that had gone up in the last few years. David had noticed it during the funeral, a cluster of cookie-cutter homes with perfect lawns and matching mailboxes. Then he started noticing the cars, lots of cars. Every morning around 7, a steady stream of vehicles would come up his driveway. At first he thought maybe they were lost or using it as a turnaround, but it kept happening. Dozens of cars every single day driving right past his house like they owned the place. David walked down to the road one morning to see where they were all going. That's when he realized the truth. His private driveway didn't just serve his property anymore. Somewhere along the way, the developers of Riverside Meadows had connected their entire neighborhood to his family's road. Every single home in that development, maybe 200 houses, was using his driveway as their only way in and out. He stood there watching car after car drive by, none of them even glancing his way. They'd put up speed limit signs. There were speed bumps he definitely didn't install. Someone had even painted fresh lines down the middle. His family's private road had been turned into a public street without anyone asking permission. David went back to the house and started digging through his grandfather's documents. He pulled out the property survey from 1967, then the updated one from 1995. He traced the property lines with his finger, following the boundaries on the old paper. There was no question about it. The entire road from the highway to his front door was on his land. Every inch of it. He found more papers. Apparently years ago, when Riverside Meadows was just starting out with maybe 10 or 15 homes, the developers had asked his grandfather if they could use the road temporarily. His grandfather, being a kind man, had said yes. But that was it. Just a verbal agreement for a few houses during construction. Nobody had ever asked about making it permanent. Nobody had ever offered to pay for an easement. They just kept building and building, adding hundreds of homes, all depending on a road they didn't own. David called the HOA president. Her name was Patricia, and she answered on the third ring. He explained who he was, that he'd inherited the property, and that he'd just discovered the situation with the road. He kept his tone friendly, assuming this was all just a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a simple conversation. Patricia's response wasn't what he expected. Her voice went cold. She told him the road had been in use for years and that the HOA considered it community property. She said he should actually be thankful they'd maintained it because it would have fallen apart otherwise. Before David could even respond, she said she had to go and hung up. He sat there staring at his phone, not quite believing what had just happened. He called back. It went to voicemail. He sent an email to the HOA's official address, laying out the situation politely and asking for a meeting to discuss the road usage. No response. Days turned into weeks. The cars kept coming morning and evening, rush hour traffic on his private property. David started noticing other things too. People would sometimes park on the side of his road when they had parties. Teenagers used it for late-night drag racing. Someone had dumped a mattress in the ditch near his mailbox. He tried approaching some of the residents directly, catching them as they drove by. Most of them looked confused when he explained the situation. A few got defensive, saying they'd been told the road was part of the HOA when they bought their houses. One man actually laughed and told him good luck with that. David realized he needed help. He made an appointment with a property lawyer in town, bringing all of his grandfather's documents with him. The lawyer, an older guy named Mr. Patterson, spread the papers across his desk and studied them carefully. He pulled out a magnifying glass to look at the survey maps. He read through the original deed line by line. After an hour of examination, Mr. Patterson looked up and smiled. He told David he had an absolutely solid case. The road was unquestionably his property. The HOA had no legal claim to it whatsoever. He explained that sometimes people try to claim what's called a prescriptive easement, where they argue that because they've used something for so long, they now have a right to it. But even that wouldn't work here. The lawyer pointed out something David hadn't known. His grandfather had been diagnosed with dementia 6 years ago. The medical records were in the file. For the last 4 years of his life, the old man had been in a nursing home, legally unable to make decisions about his property. That meant any permission he might have given during that time wouldn't count. And since Riverside Meadows had mostly been built during those years, the HOA couldn't claim they had permission. Mr. Patterson drafted a formal letter to the HOA. It was professional but firm. It explained that David owned the road, that the HOA was trespassing, and that they needed to either negotiate a proper easement agreement with appropriate compensation or stop using the road entirely. They sent it certified mail so there'd be proof of delivery. The response came 2 weeks later, not from Patricia but from a law firm in the city. The letter was 3 pages of legal language, but the message was clear. The HOA was claiming they had a right to the road through continuous use. They said that since nobody had stopped them for over 5 years, the law was on their side. They weren't going to pay David anything, and they weren't going to stop using the road. If he had a problem with that, they'd see him in court. David read the letter twice, feeling his face get hot. They were basically saying they'd stolen his property and gotten away with it, so now it was theirs. No apology, no offer to make things right, just a legal threat. He called Mr. Patterson back. The lawyer wasn't surprised. He said HOAs often acted this way, especially when they had the resources of hundreds of homeowners behind them. He asked David if he wanted to fight this. David didn't even hesitate. This was his family's land, and he wasn't going to let anyone take it without a fight. Mr. Patterson filed the lawsuit the following week. David signed all the papers and tried not to think about how much this was going to cost him. His grandfather had left him the property, but not much money to go with it. He had some savings from his old job, but legal fees weren't cheap. Still, this was about principle. You can't just let people walk all over you. The lawyer gathered everything they needed for the case. Medical records proving David's grandfather couldn't have given legal permission during his dementia. Photographs from before Riverside Meadows existed, showing the road had always been there, built and maintained by the family. The original survey maps with the property lines clearly marked. The deed itself going back 3 generations. It was an airtight case, or at least it seemed that way. Mr. Patterson sent a letter to every single household in Riverside Meadows. 200 letters, each one certified. The letter explained the situation in plain English. It told them they were driving on private property every day. It warned them that David owned the road and had every legal right to control who used it. It wasn't meant to be threatening, just informative. David wanted the residents to understand what was really going on. That's when things got ugly. The HOA board called an emergency meeting. David wasn't invited, but he heard about it from one of the residents who'd actually read his letter and felt bad about the situation. Apparently, Patricia stood up in front of everyone and painted David as some kind of villain. She said he was an outsider trying to extort the community. She claimed he was lying about owning the road and that this was all a money grab. Then came the special assessment. The HOA board voted to charge every household $500 to fight David in court. No choice, no vote from the residents, just a mandatory fee. People were angry about the charge, but Patricia convinced them it was necessary. She said if they didn't fight this, some greedy guy would hold their entire neighborhood hostage. David started getting hate mail, letters shoved under his door calling him names he wouldn't repeat. Someone threw eggs at his house. His truck got keyed in his own driveway. People would slow down as they drove past and flip him off. He'd try to wave to be friendly, and they'd just glare at him like he was the devil himself. The worst part was that most of these people had no idea what was really happening. They believed everything the HOA board told them because why wouldn't they? Patricia sent out weekly emails calling David a troublemaker. She'd twist facts and leave out important details. She never mentioned that the HOA had been using the road without permission for years. She never told them about David's grandfather's dementia or the medical records proving he couldn't have agreed to anything. One evening, David came home to find a group of residents blocking his driveway. About 15 people holding signs that said things like "Stop the Greed" and "Community Rights Matter." He had to call the police to get them to move. The officers who showed up looked uncomfortable. They made the protesters leave, but David could tell they thought he was in the wrong too. Everyone in town had heard the HOA's version of events. The legal process moved slowly. Depositions, document reviews, motions filed and denied. David's lawyer bills kept growing. $3,000, $5,000, $8,000. He'd already burned through most of his savings and the case was just getting started. Meanwhile, the HOA had $100,000 in their legal fund, money collected from all those special assessments. Mr. Patterson did his best, but David could see the worry in his eyes. Big legal firms had advantages. They could drag things out, file endless motions, make the process as expensive as possible for the other side. It was a war of attrition, and David was running out of resources. 6 months into the case, they had a hearing in front of Judge Williams. David sat in the courtroom watching lawyers argue back and forth about property rights and easements. The HOA's lawyer was smooth, talking about community needs and established patterns of use. He made it sound like David was trying to destroy people's lives over a technicality. Mr. Patterson presented their evidence. The property deed, the surveys, the medical records, everything that proved David owned the road and that the HOA had no legal claim to it. The judge listened, took notes, asked a few questions. Then he said he'd need time to consider everything and would issue a ruling in a few weeks. Those weeks felt like months. David couldn't sleep. He'd lie awake at night listening to cars drive past his house, each one a reminder of what was at stake. He thought about his grandfather, how the old man had trusted people to do the right thing, how that trust had been taken advantage of. Finally, Mr. Patterson called with news. He didn't sound happy. The judge had indicated in a preliminary conference that he was leaning toward a compromise. He didn't want to disrupt an entire community over a property dispute. The likely outcome would be a forced easement, where David would have to grant the HOA permanent access to the road in exchange for some compensation. David asked how much compensation. Mr. Patterson said probably just enough to cover the legal fees. Maybe a little extra. Nothing close to what an actual easement on that much property would be worth. Nothing close to fair. The judge basically wanted David to accept that the HOA could keep using his property because it would be too inconvenient for everyone else if he didn't. He hung up the phone and sat there in his grandfather's old study, surrounded by boxes of documents that proved he was right. What good was being right if the system didn't care? The HOA had lied, trespassed, harassed him, and now they were going to win anyway because they had more money and the court didn't want to deal with the mess. That night, David couldn't stop thinking about something his grandfather used to say. The old man had a lot of expressions, most of them about hard work and doing right by people. But there was one David kept coming back to. Sometimes people don't appreciate what they have until it's gone. He started thinking about the situation differently. Yes, the legal system was failing him. Yes, the HOA had more resources. But there was one thing they didn't have. They didn't own the road, he did. And until Judge Williams actually issued that final ruling, it was still his property, which meant he had rights. The right to decide who could and couldn't use his land. David called Mr. Patterson the next morning. He asked a simple question. What were his legal rights regarding his private property right now, before any final court decision? Could he control access to his own road? The lawyer was quiet for a moment. Then he explained that yes, technically, David had every right to restrict access to his private property. He could put up a gate if he wanted. He could require permission for anyone to use the road. As long as he gave proper notice and followed the law, there was nothing illegal about it. Mr. Patterson's voice had a warning tone, though. He said David should think carefully about what he was planning. Whatever he did would have consequences. David spent the next 3 days thinking it through. He wasn't a vindictive person. He didn't want to hurt anyone. But he also wasn't going to just roll over and let people steal from him. If the HOA residents really believed they had a right to use his road, maybe they needed to understand what life would be like without it. Maybe they needed to see the value of what they'd been taking for granted. He started researching. He looked up property laws, towing regulations, the rights of private landowners. He called contractors about building a gate. He reached out to a local towing company and asked about their services. Everything he planned was completely legal. He'd make sure of that, but it would definitely get people's attention. On a Friday afternoon, David went to the post office with 200 letters. Each one was addressed to a household in Riverside Meadows. Each one was sent certified mail with return receipt. The letter was simple and clear. It informed residents that in 72 hours, David would be restricting access to his private road. Any unauthorized vehicles found on the property after that time would be towed at the owner's expense, as was his legal right as the property owner. He also sent a copy to the HOA board, to Patricia directly, and to their lawyer. No surprises, everything by the book. If they wanted to use his road, they'd need his permission, and his permission wouldn't be free. The letters arrived on Saturday. David knew because he'd set them up with tracking. He sat at his computer watching the delivery confirmations pop up one by one. Someone in every household had signed for their letter. No one could say they didn't know what was coming. His phone started ringing within hours. Most of the calls he let go to voicemail. People yelling, people pleading, people calling him every name in the book. A few of the callers sounded genuinely worried, asking if there was any way to work this out. Those were the ones who made him feel bad. But he'd tried working it out. He'd tried being reasonable. The HOA had made their choice. Patricia sent an email to all the residents that evening. David got a copy forwarded from the same person who'd told him about the emergency meeting. The email was something else. Patricia called David's letter a desperate bluff and a pathetic intimidation tactic. She told everyone to ignore it completely. She said David couldn't legally do anything and that the HOA's lawyers had assured her this was just harassment. She ended the email by saying everyone should go about their business normally on Monday and not give in to his threats. David had to admire the confidence, even if it was completely misguided. Patricia genuinely believed he was bluffing. The HOA board had convinced themselves that no one would actually have the guts to shut down road access for 200 families. They thought this was just a negotiating tactic, a way to squeeze more money out of them. They were wrong. Sunday night, David barely slept. He kept going over everything in his mind, making sure he hadn't missed any legal details. Mr. Patterson had reviewed his plan and given a reluctant approval. The lawyer said it was risky and would make a lot of people angry, but it wasn't illegal. That was enough for David. Monday morning arrived cold and gray. David was up before dawn, watching out his window as the first contractors arrived at 5 in the morning. They brought the gate with them on a flatbed truck. It was a serious piece of equipment, heavy-duty steel with a solid lock system. The kind of thing that wouldn't be easy to break through or go around. The installation took 2 hours. They set it up right at the entrance where his property met the main road. Big clear signs went up on both sides. Private property. No trespassing. Unauthorized vehicles will be towed. The signs included the towing company's phone number and Mr. Patterson's office information for anyone who wanted to dispute it legally. By 7 in the morning, when the first wave of commuters tried to leave for work, the gate was closed and locked. David stood nearby with a camera documenting everything. He also had a simple table set up with a cash box and some paperwork. He was offering temporary daily access passes for $50. It was way less than what a proper easement would cost, but enough to make a point. The reaction was immediate and intense. Cars started backing up quickly. People got out to look at the gate, reading the signs with expressions ranging from confusion to fury. Some of them saw David standing there and came over to confront him. He stayed calm, explaining that this was his private property and they needed permission to use it. Most people didn't want to hear it. A woman in a minivan started screaming at him about her kids being late for school. A man in a business suit threatened to sue him for everything he had. Someone called him a word that would get this video taken down if he repeated it. Through it all, David just kept filming and staying professional. He offered each person the same option: pay for a daily pass or find another route. The problem was there really wasn't another route. The developers of Riverside Meadows had built the entire community with David's Road as the only real access point. There was technically a service path on the other side of the development, but it was narrow, unpaved, and added 45 minutes to anyone's commute. It had never been meant for regular use. Most people refused to pay and turned around to try the service road. A few others, the ones who absolutely had to get to work or had important appointments, grudgingly paid the $50. David gave them receipts and let them through. By 9 in the morning, he'd collected maybe $400 and turned away dozens of cars. Then the tow truck started arriving. David had hired 3 different towing companies for the day, all of them fully licensed and legal. Any car that tried to bypass the gate or sneak onto his property got towed. The drivers were efficient and professional. They'd hook up a car, document everything with photos, and haul it to the impound lot across town. The first car got towed at 7:15. A guy in a pickup truck had tried to drive around the gate through David's yard. He got stuck in the soft ground, and that's when the tow truck showed up. The driver was furious, but there was nothing he could do. His truck was on private property without permission. That was textbook trespassing. By noon, over 60 vehicles had been towed. The impound lot called David to say they were running out of space. He told them to use their overflow area and that he'd cover any extra costs. This wasn't about money for him. This was about making a point. The police showed up around 10 in the morning. 2 officers who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. They talked to David, checked his documentation, looked at the property deed he had ready. Then they talked to some of the angry residents who'd gathered nearby. After about 20 minutes, the officers came back to David and told everyone he was within his legal rights. It was his property and he could restrict access if he wanted. If people had a problem with it, they needed to take it up in court. That didn't make the residents any happier. The crowd that had gathered started getting loud. Someone threw a water bottle at David's table. The police had to tell everyone to disperse. A few people left, but most stayed, just standing there staring at the gate like they couldn't believe this was really happening. The local news showed up after lunch. A reporter and a camera operator looking for a story. At first, the reporter seemed ready to do a piece about David being unreasonable. But then David showed her all his documentation. The property deed. The letters he'd sent trying to negotiate. The HOA's refusal to work with him. The harassment he'd endured. Her whole attitude changed. She interviewed several residents too. Most of them said things like, "This is ridiculous and he can't do this to us," without really understanding the situation. But a couple of people admitted they'd had no idea the road wasn't actually HOA property. One woman said she'd been told when she bought her house that all the roads were community-owned. She looked genuinely shocked to learn the truth. The story that aired that evening wasn't what the HOA expected. Instead of painting David as a villain, it presented the facts. A man inherited property with a private road. An HOA had been using it for years without permission or compensation. The HOA refused to negotiate fairly. Now the owner was exercising his legal rights. The reporter even mentioned that the HOA president had declined to comment for the story. Tuesday was worse for Riverside Meadows. People had hoped Monday was a one-time thing, that David would make his point and back off. But Tuesday morning, the gate was still there. More cars got towed. The service road became so congested that it took some people 2 hours to get out of the neighborhood. Parents were missing work. Kids were missing school. Someone's elderly mother missed a doctor's appointment for her chemotherapy. David felt terrible about that last one. An older gentleman came to him in tears, explaining that his wife needed treatment and they couldn't get out. David immediately let him through for free and told him he'd give him a permanent pass, no charge. He wasn't trying to hurt innocent people, but he also couldn't back down now. The HOA board held another emergency meeting Tuesday night. This time David heard it was complete chaos. Residents were furious, not just at David, but at Patricia and the other board members. People wanted to know why they'd been told the road was HOA property when it wasn't. They wanted to know why the board had spent thousands on lawyers instead of just negotiating. They demanded answers. Patricia apparently tried to maintain that David was still in the wrong, that he'd pay for this somehow. But people weren't buying it anymore. They'd seen the news. They'd paid $300 to get their cars out of impound. They were stuck in their own neighborhood with no good way out. The board's credibility was falling apart. By Wednesday morning, David's phone was ringing with a different kind of call. A lawyer he'd never heard of, representing concerned residents of Riverside Meadows, not the HOA board, but actual homeowners who wanted to fix this situation. The lawyer was professional and respectful. He asked if David would be willing to meet and discuss terms for an easement agreement. David said yes, but he had conditions. After everything he'd been through, after all the harassment and legal bills and stress, he wasn't going to settle for pennies. He wanted fair market value for the easement. He wanted all his legal fees covered. And he wanted it in writing that the HOA board members who'd caused this mess would step down. The lawyer said he'd take that back to his clients and get back to David. In the meantime, the tow trucks kept working. Wednesday afternoon brought something David hadn't expected. A group of about 20 residents walked up to his gate carrying a white flag. Literally. Someone had tied a white t-shirt to a broom handle. Under different circumstances, he might have laughed. An older man stepped forward as the spokesperson. He introduced himself as Robert and said he'd lived in Riverside Meadows since it was first built. He looked exhausted. He told David that he and these other folks had no idea about the road situation until David's letters arrived. They'd been lied to by the HOA board, and now they were suffering the consequences. He asked very politely if there was any way to end this. David felt something shift inside him. These weren't the people who'd thrown eggs at his house. These weren't the ones who'd called him names. These were just regular people caught in a bad situation. He invited Robert and 2 others onto his property to talk. They sat at his kitchen table and had an honest conversation for the first time since this whole thing started. Robert explained that when people bought homes in Riverside Meadows, they were explicitly told all infrastructure was part of the development. Nobody knew the main road was privately owned. The HOA board had kept that information hidden, probably because they knew it was a problem. Now everyone was paying the price for that deception. David shared his side too, the harassment, the legal bills, the judge who was ready to rule against him despite having all the evidence. He explained that he'd tried doing things the right way and got nowhere. This was his only option to get people's attention. Robert nodded. He said he understood, even though it was painful for everyone involved. By the time they finished talking, David had agreed to keep offering the daily passes at the $50 rate, and to give free permanent passes to anyone who could prove they'd had a medical emergency or serious hardship. It wasn't a solution, but it was something. Robert thanked him and left with his group, looking slightly less defeated than when they'd arrived. The news coverage continued. By Wednesday evening, the story had been picked up by regional outlets. David started getting calls from reporters in other cities. The narrative was shifting more and more toward the HOA's mismanagement. People online were discussing it, taking sides. Most of the comments David saw were surprisingly supportive of his position. Phrases like "play stupid games, win stupid prizes" showed up a lot. Thursday morning, the impound lot called again. They'd towed another 40 vehicles over the previous day. The lot manager said they were completely full now and couldn't take any more cars. David told him that was fine. He'd hired additional towing companies who were taking vehicles to lots in neighboring towns. The towing situation had become a logistical operation. More people were paying for daily passes now. The service road had become such a nightmare that spending $50 was actually the cheaper option when you factored in gas and time. David had processed over 100 daily passes by Thursday afternoon. He kept meticulous records of every transaction, knowing this might all end up back in court. That's when Patricia finally cracked. She showed up at David's gate in her luxury SUV, looking like she hadn't slept in days. Her perfect hair wasn't so perfect anymore. Her makeup was smudged. She got out of her car and marched up to him with her phone out filming. She started demanding he end this immediately, said he was destroying the community, called him selfish and cruel. Her voice got louder and louder. David just stood there calmly, knowing his own cameras were recording everything. When she finally ran out of steam, he said 3 words. "Call your lawyer." Patricia lost it. She started screaming that she was the victim here, that everyone was blaming her for something that wasn't her fault. David pointed out that she'd been the one who told residents to ignore his letters. She'd been the one who said he was bluffing. She'd been the one who refused to negotiate from the start. Every decision that led to this moment had been hers. She got back in her SUV and drove away, but not before David noticed she was crying. He almost felt bad. Almost. Then he remembered the hate mail and the keyed truck and the months of harassment. Patricia had made her choices. Now she was living with the consequences. Friday brought the breakthrough David had been waiting for. The lawyer who'd called earlier rang back with news. A group of residents had gotten together and hired an independent appraiser to evaluate what a fair easement would actually cost. The number came back at $400,000. It was substantial, but it was the honest market value for permanent access rights to that much private road. The resident's lawyer said his clients were prepared to pay that amount, plus all of David's legal fees, which had climbed past $12,000. But there was one more condition they needed David to agree to. They wanted him to work with them to recall the entire HOA board and hold new elections. The residents didn't trust Patricia or the other board members anymore. They wanted leadership that would be honest and actually work in the community's interest. David didn't need time to think about it. He said yes immediately. This was exactly what he'd been hoping for. Not just compensation, but actual change. Accountability for the people who'd caused this mess in the first place. The lawyer said he'd drop the agreement, and they could meet on Monday to sign everything. In the meantime, he asked if David would be willing to suspend the gate and towing over the weekend as a show of good faith. David agreed, but only if the HOA board members agreed to resign immediately. The lawyer said he'd make sure it happened. That Friday evening, David got an email. It was from Patricia, sent to her entire contact list with David included. The subject line just said resignation. In the email, she announced that she and 2 other board members were stepping down effective immediately. She didn't apologize. She didn't admit any wrongdoing. She just said it was in the best interest of the community, and that she hoped everyone would remember her service over the years. The responses to that email started flooding in almost instantly. David could see them because Patricia had sent it as a mass email instead of using blind copies. Residents weren't holding back. They called her out for her lies, for her mismanagement, for her arrogance. One person calculated that her decisions had cost the community over $200,000 in special assessments, legal fees, and impound charges. Another pointed out that if she'd just been honest from the start, none of this would have happened. David opened the gate Friday night. Cars started flowing through again immediately. He stood there watching them go by, and something strange happened. A few people honked and waved. One man stopped and rolled down his window to say thank you. A woman dropped off a plate of cookies with a note apologizing for not speaking up sooner. Not everyone was friendly. Some people still glared at him as they drove past. Some probably blamed him for everything that had happened. But David noticed a difference. The residents were talking to each other now. They were asking questions about how their HOA was run. They were paying attention to who was making decisions and why. Over the weekend, David learned more about what had been going on inside Riverside Meadows. Apparently, Patricia and the board had been running things like their personal kingdom for years. They'd approved construction projects from their friends' companies without competitive bidding. They'd raised fees without properly accounting for where the money went. The road situation was just the tip of the iceberg. Robert called Sunday evening to update David on the recall process. He said the response had been overwhelming. Nearly every household had signed the petition demanding new elections. They'd scheduled it for 2 weeks out, with several residents already announcing they'd run for the board. People who actually cared about transparency and good management. Robert also mentioned something else. Several residents had gotten together to clean up David's property. All those months of cars driving through had left trash and damage. They'd picked up litter, fixed some broken fence posts, and even filled in the ruts that cars had made trying to go around the gate. Robert said it was the least they could do. Monday morning came with sunshine and a feeling David hadn't experienced in months. Hope. He met with the resident's lawyer at Mr. Patterson's office. The agreement was already drawn up, everything spelled out clearly. $400,000 for a permanent easement allowing Riverside Meadows residents to use the road, full reimbursement of David's legal fees, and a clause stating that the HOA would maintain the road going forward, including any repairs or improvements. David signed. The lawyer signed on behalf of the residents. Mr. Patterson notarized everything. It was done. After months of fighting, it was actually done. The lawyer said the money would be transferred within 3 business days. He also handed David a separate document. It was a letter signed by over 50 residents, apologizing for the harassment and thanking him for standing up for what was right. David read through the names. Some he recognized, some he didn't, but each signature represented someone who'd taken the time to admit they'd been wrong. That meant something. The money hit David's account on Thursday. $400,000. He sat staring at his phone screen, watching the numbers in his banking app. It was more money than he'd ever had in his life. More than his grandfather probably ever had. All from standing up for what was right. The first thing he did was pay Mr. Patterson. The lawyer tried to give him a discount, saying David had been through enough. But David insisted on paying every penny owed. Mr. Patterson had believed in him when it would have been easier to just advise settling. That loyalty was worth something. With the legal bills settled, David started thinking about what to do with the rest. He could have just kept it, lived comfortably for years. But every time he looked at that money, he thought about his grandfather. The old man would have done something meaningful with it. Something that mattered. David decided to renovate the farmhouse properly. Not just fixing the broken stuff, but restoring it to how it looked when his grandfather was young. He hired local contractors, the kind of small businesses his grandfather had always supported. They replaced the roof, updated the wiring, refinished the hardwood floors. The old place started looking beautiful again. He also set up a scholarship fund. The grandfather's name went on it, with money set aside to help local kids go to college, especially kids from families that didn't have much. His grandfather had grown up poor but managed to build something through hard work. David wanted to help others have that same chance. The HOA elections happened right on schedule. The turnout was huge, something like 90% of households voting. That almost never happened in HOA elections. Usually people didn't pay attention until something went wrong. But Riverside Meadows residents had learned their lesson about the cost of not paying attention. The new board was completely different from the old one. Robert won a seat. So did a retired accountant who promised to make the HOA's finances transparent. A young lawyer who specialized in property law joined the board too. These weren't people looking for power. They were people who wanted to fix what had been broken. One of the new board's first actions was to officially recognize David's easement and agree to all the maintenance terms. They also voted to set up a reserve fund specifically for road maintenance, so there'd never be any question about keeping it in good condition. Everything was documented properly this time, filed with the county, completely legitimate. David kept the gate, but he had it modified. Instead of keeping it closed, it stayed open most of the time. He installed an automatic system with a code that all the easement holders had. If there was ever an emergency or a problem, he could close it remotely. But for everyday use, the road was accessible. The gate just served as a reminder of who actually owned the property. Things got quieter after that. The news crews moved on to other stories. The angry protesters found something else to be angry about. Life in Riverside Meadows went back to normal, or at least a new version of normal where people paid attention to how their community was run. David started seeing some of the residents around town. At the grocery store, the hardware store, the local diner. Some ignored him, but others would nod or say hello. Robert became something like a friend. They'd have coffee sometimes and talk about how the new board was doing. Robert said the community was better now, more engaged. The situation with the road had been painful, but it had woken people up. There were a few residents who never forgave David. He'd see them occasionally, and they'd make sure he knew they still blamed him for everything. One woman posted on social media regularly about how he'd terrorized the neighborhood. David didn't respond. Some people would always need someone to blame, and he'd made peace with being that person for them. The most surprising thing was the apologies that kept coming. Months after everything was settled, he'd still get occasional letters or emails from residents saying they were sorry. They'd explain that they'd believed the HOA's version of events and felt terrible about how they'd treated him. Some offered to help with projects around his property. Others just wanted him to know they recognized he'd been right. David accepted the apologies but didn't make a big deal of it. People had been scared and angry and misled. That didn't excuse the harassment, but he understood it. He'd rather move forward than hold grudges. The old service road got paved eventually. The new HOA board decided the community needed a proper backup route in case anything ever happened to David's road. They did it right this time, with proper permits and engineering. It cost them a lot, but residents voted to approve it. They'd learned that shortcuts come back to bite you. Patricia disappeared from the area. David heard through Robert that she'd moved to another state. Apparently, the whole situation had destroyed her reputation in the community. No one wanted her on any committees or boards anymore. A few people felt bad for her, saying she'd just made mistakes. But most felt she'd gotten what she deserved. David found out later that Patricia and the other board members had known all along that they didn't own the road. There were emails that came out during the board transition, showing they'd discussed the issue years ago. They'd decided to just use the road anyway, and hope no one noticed or cared enough to fight them. It was a calculated risk that backfired spectacularly. The local law school actually reached out to David about his case. They wanted to use it as a teaching example in their property law classes. David agreed and even went in to speak to a class once. The students asked good questions about easements, property rights, and the ethics of the situation. One student asked if he'd do anything differently. David thought about it and said no. Sometimes you have to stand up for yourself even when it's hard. As time passed, David settled into life on the property. He got a dog, a rescue mutt that loved running through the fields. He started a vegetable garden in the spot where his grandfather used to have one. He learned how to fix things around the property himself, the way the old man had. It felt good working with his hands, taking care of the land. The road had his family's name on it now. He'd gotten it officially registered with the county as Patterson Family Road. There was a sign at the entrance, small and tasteful. Every time he drove past it, he thought about 3 generations of his family who'd owned this land. He'd protected their legacy even when it cost him. Sometimes on summer evenings, David would sit on his porch and watch the cars go by. The evening rush hour, people heading home from work. Kids in the back seats probably complaining about homework. Parents thinking about dinner. Normal life happening on a road that had caused so much trouble. He'd think about what his grandfather used to say about people not appreciating what they had until it was gone. The residents of Riverside Meadows had learned that lesson the hard way. They'd taken the road for granted, assumed it would always be there, never bothered to ask important questions about who owned it. Then suddenly it was gone and they understood its value, but they'd also learned something else. They'd learned to pay attention, to ask questions, to hold their leaders accountable. The whole community was better run now because people gave a damn about how things were managed. That was probably worth more than the $400,000 in the long run. David used some of the settlement money to add to the scholarship fund every year. By the time 5 years had passed, they'd helped send 20 kids to college. Kids who might not have had that chance otherwise. His grandfather would have loved that. The old man had always believed in investing in people. The story became kind of famous in property law circles. David would occasionally see references to it online, usually in discussions about easements and property rights. Some people used it as an example of why you should always verify what you own. Others used it to show what happens when HOAs abuse their power. A few people even called it the Great Road War, which always made David smile. Life wasn't perfect. David still had moments where he'd get angry thinking about everything he'd been through. The harassment, the legal fees, the months of stress. But then he'd look around at his renovated house, his thriving garden, his happy dog. He'd think about the scholarship kids and the improved HOA and the lesson learned by an entire community. His grandfather used to say another thing David remembered now. Sometimes the right thing is the hard thing. Standing up to the HOA had been hard. Really hard. But it was right. And in the end, everyone was better off for it, even if some people couldn't admit it. On the 5-year anniversary of the settlement, Robert organized a small gathering. Just a few residents who'd been supportive from early on, the new board members and David. They met at the community center and Robert gave a little speech about how far Riverside Meadows had come. He talked about transparency and accountability and the importance of knowing your rights. At the end, Robert raised a glass. "To David," he said, "for reminding us that property rights matter and for teaching us to ask the right questions." Everyone drank to that. David felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the wine. This was what it felt like when things worked out. Not perfect, but right. As David drove home that night on Patterson Family Road, he noticed something. The road was in great condition. The HOA had been maintaining it perfectly, just as promised. The lights they'd installed made it safe to drive it.